Lorraine Beck had prayed over harder things than weather, but she had never prayed over a tractor before. At 67, she knew what drought could do, what hospital corridors could do, and what interest could do when a note came due at the wrong time. Old iron, though, was supposed to be the simple part of farm. Tell me in the comments if your family ever had one piece of equipment everybody argued about, but nobody could quite let go of. On some farms, it is a combine. On some, it is a baler. And on places like the Becks, it can hold more memory, more pride, and more hard math than anybody wants to admit out loud. The faded 1970 John Deere 3020 sat under the south shed in Douglas County, Missouri. One rear tire pressed into red dust while a bank letter waited on the kitchen table beside Earl Beck's Bible. Its paint had gone dull years ago. The left fender wore a ripple from an old gatepost, and the loader arms still carried the scuff spots where Earl chained feed bunks every February. By the time the coffee cooled, Daniel had already said no twice. Ruth had already said they might not have a choice. Owen had stayed quiet long enough that the kitchen clock sounded louder than the three of them put together, and Lorraine could feel the whole room leaning toward a fight before anybody looked up from the floor. Ozark Regional had given them 11 days. 11 days to bring down the note, bring current what was late, and prove the Beck place was still a business instead of a family memory with bills attached to it. 11 days while the winter hay stack got shorter. The tax notice sat under a salt shaker, and Earl's empty chair stayed pulled back from the table in a way that no longer bent with him. What made no sense to Ruth was that the bank wanted the old tractor first. It was the only machine on the place without a payment tied to it. The only one Daniel could still repair with a socket set and a neighbor's parts shelf, and the only one Lorraine knew Earl trusted more than any salesman who had ever stopped in their lane. If Lorraine signed a wrong paper, they might keep the debt alive and kill the family doing it. Daniel would call it surrender. Ruth would call it reality. Owen would call it his fault, even if nobody said the words. And there was a real chance they would not all be sitting at that same table next Christmas. Because the tractor was not just an old machine, and the note was not just about hay and cattle. Before the bank meeting was over, Lorraine's children were going to drag an older secret into the open, and the only way to understand why they refused to let that tractor leave was to understand why Earl Beck had been hiding numbers before he died. The Beck place sat about 8 miles outside Ava. With a blacktop narrowed, the church signs got hand-painted, and the road turned to red clay as soon as the county grader missed a week. They owned 265 acres in 3 pieces. The home place with the white-sided house and machine shed, the north hay ground that rolled harder than it looked from the road, and a creek 40 that should have been clear and easy by now, but was not. They ran 46 black, baldy cow-calf pairs, cut hay on 112 acres, and still rented 38 acres of bottom ground from an older neighbor when the season looked kind enough to justify it. Earl Beck had been the sort of man who never talked much in town, but could stand beside an open hood for an hour and tell you where a machine had started going wrong just by the sound it made under strain. He and Lorraine had bought that John Deere 3020 at a Marshfield consignment sale in the spring of 1989 for $9,700, right after the drought of the late 80s had taught him a lesson he never forgot. He said newer equipment made you feel successful faster than it made you solvent. After that, he kept one rule as best he could: always have one machine on the place that was truly yours. Daniel, the oldest son still living at home, was 39 and built like the work had shaped him that way on purpose. He knew which fence post leaned before you got to it and could tell how many bales were left in the sow stack by glancing once through the shed. Ruth, 43, lived in Ava and did bookkeeping for the school district. She had not left the family behind in a hard-hearted way. She had simply learned years ago that somebody in the Beck family needed to understand a ledger as well as Daniel understood a calving pen. Owen, the youngest at 35, had come back the year before after a divorce, a failed trucking business, and the kind of quiet embarrassment that makes a man useful with his hands and absent with his eyes. Faith on the Beck place was never loud. Lorraine kept Earl's Bible on the kitchen table because that was where he actually read it, not because it made for a prettier room. Sunday meant MT Zion Baptist at 10:30, fried chicken or leftovers by 1, and chore clothes back on by mid-afternoon. Earl used to say you could pray for rain and still grease a bearing, and Lorraine had held on to that line because it sounded like the only kind of religion farm life ever really trusted. The old 30-20 had been part of all of it. Ruth learned to steer sitting on Earl's lap with one hand braced against that same dented fender. Daniel had fed cows with it through sleet, pulled stuck calves closer to the barn with it, and used the loader to scrape pins when the newer tractor wouldn't start. Owen had raked hay behind it as a teenager and once backed it into the side of the shed, so hard Earl refused to speak to him until after supper. It was not the biggest machine on the place and not the prettiest. It was just the one that kept showing up when the rest of life got expensive. The Beck's real trouble did not begin with the bank letter. It began the summer before, when August gave them less than an inch of rain and the second cutting of hay never amounted to more than wishful thinking. By October, their calves were averaging 57 pounds lighter at weaning than the year before. Feed cost more. Diesel cost more. Mineral cost more. Every small thing that a man tells himself he can absorb in July starts looking like a verdict by January. Then there was Earl's illness. Pancreatic cancer had a way of making time feel both rushed and endless. And by the time hospice came through that front door, Lorraine had stopped asking what the bills were going to total because she already knew the answer would be more than they had. Some of those hospital charges got rolled into a consolidation note. Some landed on credit cards they should never have carried that long. Some simply sat there like shame in white envelopes until Ruth came over one Saturday and stacked them by date on the kitchen counter. When Ruth finally spread the numbers out in front of Daniel after Christmas, the problem was no longer vague. Ozark Regional held an operating line at $126,800. There was another $41,600 on the consolidation note tied to land. Property taxes were $6,180 behind. Interest had climbed enough that the renewal meeting was not going to be a handshake and a signature. The bank wanted exposure reduced by $22,000 before it would roll the paper again, and Karen Dillard from the Ava branch had already asked for an updated equipment list, livestock count, and anything on the place that was clear title and saleable. Daniel knew what that meant the moment he heard the phrase clear title. He just did what a lot of farm people do when they already hate the likely answer. He stalled. He said calf prices might firm up. He said maybe they could stretch feed longer if January stayed open. He said the bank always asked hard questions before renewal. Ruth let him talk until he ran out of ways to turn weather into math. Owen tried to help in the ways a guilty man helps. He fixed a gate, replaced a hose, drove to town for feed, and kept saying he would find something steadier than odd hauling and tire shop work. None of it touched the note. Lorraine watched all three of her children circling the same problem from different directions and knew they were not only afraid of losing money. They were afraid of naming which decisions, whose mistakes, and whose silence had brought the place that close to the edge. The worst wound on that farm was not the drought, and it was not the cancer. It was the thing Daniel found in a metal file box 3 days after Earl's funeral, when he went looking for life insurance papers and came up instead with a refinance packet on the Creek 40. July 2021. Signatures from Earl and Lorraine. Money disbursed not to seed, not to hay equipment, not to vet bills, but to retire debt connected to Owen's trucking business after a blown engine, a missed contract, and a bank that had gotten tired of promises. Daniel had not said much when he found it. That was part of the problem. He took the papers to Lorraine that same evening, and she cried before she defended herself. Earl had wanted one more chance to help Owen get clear. Owen was already losing the marriage. He was already drowning. Earl said if the farm could carry one burden long enough to keep his son from disappearing under it, then that was what the farm was for. Lorraine signed because her husband was sick, her son was ashamed, and she could not stand the thought of one more failure landing in that house all at once. Ruth did not know any of that. She had been told the pressure came from medical bills, and she believed it because cancer was visible and trucking losses were not. So when the bank let her mention the land-tied note and Daniel's jaw hardened in a way she had seen before, she realized there had been a second story running underneath the first one all along. That discovery landed on her harder than the debt itself. Number she could work with, being kept outside the truth by the people who always said family mattered most, was another thing altogether. Owen knew Daniel hated what that refinance represented. Not just the money, the unfairness of it. Daniel had stayed, worked cheap, missed chances, and kept the place moving while land he expected to inherit clean one day had been tied up to rescue the brother who left. Daniel never said it that nakedly, because country families are practiced at leaving the real sentence half-finished. But the anger was there every time Owen mentioned selling anything. Every time Ruth said practical. Every time Lorraine asked them all to be gentle with one another without first being fully honest. That was why the old tractor argument felt so much bigger than a machine. By the time Ozark Regional put its finger on the 30-20, it had already landed on the exact place where sacrifice, resentment, guilt, and inheritance were all knotted together. 2 mornings before the bank meeting, Lorraine got up before Daniel, turned on the stove for heat even though the house furnace still worked, and sat down with the bank letter, a yellow legal pad, and Earl's Bible. She did not open the Bible right away. She just rested her hand on it and admitted what she had been avoiding, which for her was the real start of prayer. She was scared of the bank. She was scared of the numbers. But more than that, she was scared that one wrong decision would make her children honest in all the worst ways and never bring them back together again. When she finally opened the pages, she was not looking for a slogan. She was looking for enough quiet to say the truth without dressing it up. Earl had underlined plenty over the years, but what held her that morning was not even a verse. It was a penciled note in the margin from years earlier, in his blocky handwriting. Do the next right chore. That was as close to theology as Earl usually wrote down. So Lorraine made one decision before the meeting ever happened. No more half-truths. No more protecting one child by confusing another. No more pretending that memory and wisdom were the same thing. When Daniel came in from checking the hay shed, she told them straight that if they were going to fight, they were going to fight with every fact on the table. When Ruth arrived later that afternoon, Lorraine handed her the refinance papers herself. Owen did not look up for a full 10 seconds when he realized what had just happened. Faith in that kitchen did not sound grand. It sounded like Lorraine saying, "We're not going to pray around the truth anymore." And because she said it before the bank, before the numbers, and before the next argument, everybody at that table knew the day had changed. Ozark Regional's Ava branch smelled like printer toner, stale coffee, and wet coats drying too slowly. Karen Dillard was not a villain in pearls and high heels. She was a middle-aged vice president in a navy sweater who had seen too many farm families come in hoping personality could replace cash flow. She spoke plainly slid copies across the desk, and kept a legal pad lined with questions none of the Becks wanted to hear. She told them the bank's position was simple. Bring current the taxes. Reduce exposure by at least $22,000. Show a workable plan for 2026 that did not depend on perfect weather or stronger prices appearing just because they were overdue. Then she tapped the equipment sheet and circled the John Deere 3020, the stock trailer, and a set of spare running gear. These are the easiest clear title assets, she said. If you want cooperation from us, we need cooperation from you. Daniel hated the phrase clear title assets almost as much as he hated the next one. Karen called the 3020 non-essential. She did not mean it emotionally. She meant there was a newer 6110M on the place, and the old machine had sale value that could be converted quickly. Ruth understood the logic as soon as Karen laid it out. The 3020 would likely bring around $18,500. The stock trailer might do another $3,000. There was the principal reduction the bank wanted, nearly in one move. Daniel leaned forward hard enough to flatten the pages under his hand. He said the 3020 was the only tractor on the place they could actually afford to keep running if they had to cut back. He said selling the machine with no payment while hanging on to the one with a note was backwards. Karen replied that keeping every useful asset is exactly how a struggling farm convinces itself it still has options when it no longer has enough margin to carry them all. Ruth did not like Karen's tone, but she could not dismiss the math. Lorraine sat at the end of the desk and watched the whole thing reduce itself to the oldest kind of farm argument. Short-term relief against long-term survival. Owen barely spoke until Karen asked if there were any other liquid assets not listed. Then he said no too quickly, and Daniel shot him a look that reminded Lorraine how little of this meeting was really about banking. Karen gave them until Monday at 4 o'clock. Sell the 3020 and trailer, or bring her another written plan substantial enough to replace that reduction. Not hope, not sentiment, not family history, a plan. The real meeting started after they got home. Ruth spread the bank papers across the kitchen table like she was back at work reconciling numbers that belonged to somebody too tired to read them straight. She said what nobody wanted to hear. The bank was not wrong about the immediate value. Daniel answered with what Ruth least wanted to hear. Immediate value was not the same thing as good judgment. If we sell the only tractor without a payment, he said, we're keeping the expensive one just because it looks more respectable on a machine list. Ruth snapped back that respectable was not the issue, survival was. Daniel said survival did not mean doing exactly what the bank found easiest. Owen tried to speak twice and failed both times. Lorraine let it run longer than she normally would because some fights are already happening whether a mother likes it or not. Then Owen finally said the one sentence that made the whole room stop. Dad refinanced that 40 because of me, and if that tractor goes, it ought to go because of me too. He said it flat, like a man too tired to protect himself any further. He admitted the engine failure, the missed payments, the bank calls he let Earl answer for him. He admitted Earl had covered more than the family knew because he was embarrassed and because by then everything in his life felt like it was breaking in public. Ruth turned on Lorraine then, not Owen, not cruelly, but with the clean hurt of someone who had been expected to love a family arrangement she was never allowed to see. Lorraine took it because she had earned it. She said she signed a refinance because she was trying to save a son while her husband was dying, and she never found a later moment that felt less painful to confess. Daniel stood up, walked to the sink, and stayed there until he could speak without making the wound worse. When he came back, he brought a yellow pad from the counter. He had been doing numbers his own way all week. Sell the 6110M, he said, not the 3020. Sell the disc mower. Drop the rented 38 acres. Cut the herd from 46 pairs to 31. Let Hank Sutter custom bale the second cutting if they got one. Use the 30/20 for feeding, loader work, raking, auger work, and every smaller job they had once convinced themselves required newer iron. It would mean more hours, uglier days, less scale, and no pretending they were still operating like Earl had before the cancer. Ruth said the plan sounded like giving up. Daniel said maybe what they needed to give up was size, not the place. Owen offered to sell his enclosed trailer and take the feed mill job he had been stalling on. Ruth, after a long silence, said if they took Daniel's plan to the bank, then she would do the monthly reports herself so the numbers did not arrive half-finished and late. Lorraine looked around that table and understood the difference between a family begging for rescue and a family finally accepting the cost of staying together. Faith showed up that night as apology before it showed up as hope. The next morning, Ruth came early to help Lorraine find clean titles and serial numbers before Karen's deadline. She went into Earl's roll-top desk looking for the 30/20 paperwork and came out with something better, a spiral notebook labeled Winter Numbers 2024. Earl had written down everything in his square, patient handwriting: parts, service calls, diesel, insurance, def, monthly notes. There, in two side-by-side columns, was the comparison Daniel had been trying to explain from memory. 3,020 repairs and fuel across 12 months. $1,184. 61 10M payment, insurance, service, def across the same stretch. $19,732. And under the columns, one line from Earl: if this farm ever gets cornered again, keep what is ours. Ruth sat down right there at the desk and read it twice. Then she turned a few more pages and found Hank Sutter's number with a note beside it. Asked about custom baling if we ever have to get smaller. Earl had known. Maybe not this exact bank letter, this exact winter, this exact fight. But he knew where the danger was. Not in old machinery. In payments that kept requiring the next good year before the current one had finished hurting you. At 3:10 that afternoon, the Beck stood in the south shed beside the 30/20 and called Karen Dillard on speakerphone. Lorraine did the talking. She said they were not selling the old tractor. Then Ruth read the revised plan clean and direct. The 6110M was being consigned, the disc mower was being sold, 15 cows would go through the sale barn, the rented ground would be dropped, taxes would be brought current, and Ruth would deliver monthly cash flow reports herself. Owen's trailer sale would cover the gap on the tax notice if needed. Daniel said nothing until the end, when Karen asked if he understood the labor trade-offs. Yes, he said. That's why we're choosing the machine we can still afford after the sale, not before it. Karen did not bless them. She did something more believable. She paused, recalculated, and told them if the consignment sheets and tax receipt were on her desk by Monday morning, she would rewrite the renewal under the smaller plan. No machinery purchases. Monthly reporting. Reduced line. Tighter terms. But she would rewrite it. The 6110M brought $60,800 at Mansfield. After the note payoff, it left enough room to matter. The disc mower brought $8,900. 15 cows averaged strong enough to help. Those selling them felt like cutting into the future. Owen's trailer sold for $5,400. None of it looked triumphant. It looked like subtraction. But when Lorraine carried the tax receipt into Ozark Regional the next Monday, she did it with the 30/20 title still in her purse. That was the refusal. Not a speech, not a miracle. A family choosing the harder math because it gave them a better chance at keeping the land. The Beck place survived, but it did not stay the same. By spring, they were farming smaller on purpose. The rented bottom ground was gone. The herd was down to 31 pairs. Hank Sutter handled the heavier baling work. They no longer had equipment or time to chase. Daniel did more with the 30-20 and more by hand than he had in years. Some mornings he missed the cab tractor so badly he could feel it in his temper before breakfast. Some evenings he looked at the open space in the shed where the 6110M had stood and knew exactly what they had given up to keep the rest. Owen took the feed mill job in town and came home in time for evening chores. It was not the glamorous comeback men imagine when they come back to family ground. It was hourly work, stiff shoulders, and the humiliation of having to prove steadiness one weekday at a time. Ruth came out every Friday evening with folders, envelopes, and bank printouts. She still had not forgotten being lied to. That did not disappear because the tractor stayed, but the numbers were honest now, and sometimes honesty is the first form reconciliation takes. Lorraine kept learning the difference between saved and easy. No surprise inheritance surfaced. No mystery deed turned up in a drawer. No sudden rainstorm solved the whole year before it started. The Creek 40 would stay tied up for a while longer. The house still felt wrong without Earl in it. The cost of cancer did not vanish because the bank renewed a line. The cost of silence did not vanish because the family finally stopped practicing it. But the farm became more truthful. That mattered. The 30-20 kept feeding cattle, dragging lanes, lifting hay rings, and starting some mornings only after Daniel muttered at it longer than he should have. It was not magic. It smoked blue on cold starts and leaked enough hydraulic oil to remind everyone it was made of metal, not memory. Still, every chore it handled without a payment attached to it was one less lie they had to tell themselves about how farms stay alive. Lorraine still prayed at the kitchen table. Only now she was not praying for a way to hide the truth long enough for everybody to stay polite. She was praying for enough strength to live inside the truth they had already chosen. On some farms, that is closer to peace than anything flashy ever gets. If you had been sitting at that Beck family table, would you have sold the only paid-for tractor to satisfy the bank, or would you have shrunk the farm to keep it? And if the debt had been tangled up with family silence, what would have been harder for you to forgive? The numbers or the secret behind them? Some farms are not saved by getting bigger. Some are saved by getting honest enough to survive smaller. If this story hits something real for you about land, debt, old machinery, or the choices families make under pressure, say so in the comments.